Good evening. I'm Connor Exum of the Leon Trotsky Revolutionary Newsletter and Podcast, and I'm joined by a very special guest, Mike Ter Maat, Libertarian Vice President candidate and financial expert, also a former police officer from Dade County, Miami, and is also a little tied to this upstate area, RPI graduate aeronautical engineering, which we'll talk about some aviation because I never get to talk about aviation with any of my guests because nobody likes it. So let's get started. Mr. Ter Maat, good evening.
Connor, it's great to be with you. I hope you'll call me Mike. It is good to be with a fellow New Yorker.
Well, yes. So I will call you Mike. I just like to be formal on the introduction. That way everyone feel things out. So you're running for candidate for the vice president's candidacy. And let's explain that a little bit because I don't think people really understand. I mean, I had a big misunderstanding. I thought it was, you go to the convention and the two top vote getters get into those slots. Number one is the president and number two is the vice president. Kind of like how we used to do it during regular elections of like 150 years ago. There were no tickets. You just all ran for president, and first guy that got the presidency, next guy got the vice president. That was your.
Those were the days, huh? That's before even my time. We have an open convention in the Libertarian Party. We had our convention in May, and Chase Oliver, our presidential nominee, received the most votes. A bunch of us were campaigning. Several of us were campaigning for the presidential nomination. Chase got the most votes. He wound up our presidential nominee. We had a separate vote for vice president. Chase endorsed me, which I believe was a major factor. And I was selected as the vice presidential nominee. So we formed a ticket. We make a pretty good pair. We're both in the, toward the middle of the libertarian spectrum. Maybe I shade a little bit to the right and him a little bit to the left of center as libertarians go. But we're fairly mainstream as far as libertarianism is concerned.
So I'm not expecting too much talk about the total dissolution of the country that some libertarians go as far as saying.
Well, I don't know what you mean by country. Do you mean the government?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, what we call the political nation state. How about that? Is that that apparatus?
Yes, I think that we could do without much of the political nation state. I think that we could do without actually probably what we would call most of the federal government. And I think that we could do without a great deal of each of the state governments as well. It's easy to live without most of what the federal government does because state governments could pick it up. Even if you loved government, right? And I know that you don't. But even if you loved government, you wouldn't necessarily need such a ridiculously large federal government as we do today because the states could pick up most of what it does.
So so that would play into your idea of, removing certain agencies. I mean, usually the favorites are the Department of Education. Am I on the right list? The Department of Energy.
That's pretty easy to do without because it's not an agency that even purports to provide a service. It's just a regulatory function that local governments can handle on their own.
Yeah, but we've seen what happens when we regulate education to a certain degree, right? I mean, Florida has had one of the highest levels of charter school failure in the country. So we need some kind of regulation there.
That's actually not true on both fronts, Connor. Neither one of those statements is true. First of all, you had Florida doing whatever it's done with federal regulation, right? We haven't had a deregulated environment, number one. Number two, it is not true that charter schools, we've had charter schools, a number of them failed, not only in Florida, but elsewhere too. But it is not true that charter schools underperform public schools in general.
No, they perform exactly the same. A 2012 report from the Florida State Department of Education had that same conclusion, but they also said that they did, and at the time they were 80% more likely to fail. So, I mean, you need something to manufacture this. I mean, this raw capitalism thing here, right? I mean, as an anarcho-syndicalist, I would prefer a group of people,
You mean financial failure? Some
Financial
organizations
failure. Yes, we're talking about financial failure.
Yes, exactly. Well, public schools can't fail because the governments won't let them. What we want is more competition. Certainly, you would agree that what we want are more service providers trying to do a good job by their constituents.
Okay, we could get more service providers, but when you have more service providers, right, you also have a higher contingency of failure. I mean,
well, in any business, in any business, you've got some that do well and some that don't do well, and some expand and some contract and some fail. Absolutely. That's what you want, isn't it?
But I don't know if we want that in education.
Well, of course you do. It's not really all that different than any other business. You wouldn't say, oh, our university system is awful just because a few universities failed. You wouldn't say that about any business.
No, I wouldn't say that, but I'd say that that maybe we should start looking at education a little differently. We should take it out of that bubble, right? We should put it in a more protected bubble that we can, ensure
that's what it's in now.
Yeah,
that's what it's in now. It's completely protected, and it's one of the most underperforming and frustrating industries on the planet.
Yeah, but
as a matter of fact, you probably just saw the data that came out yesterday that is plastered all over the television about how everyone is upset with the performance of public schools, K through 12. And for a reason. It's an industry that hasn't performed very well. And it's no coincidence that it's completely protected.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not why it hasn't performed well. It's performed well. We see the studies. I mean, even what was it? Oh God,
that's exactly why it hasn't performed well. Because
did you read the study from? Oh God, it was the same group that did the big studies in the set. It was Daniel Eisenberg, and I can't think of the name of that company. McDonnell Douglas formed it. Oh, what's the name of it? Well, they did a whole big study, right? And they found out that what happened was the corporations had come in, right, the big ones, and it started selling. We turned it into a profit mining operation. We're seeing that more and more tech industries wanted to drive their computers into classrooms, and it deteriorated the educational standards right there. I mean, now whether or not that's
you're trying to convince people that public schools have been underperforming because of computers.
No, yeah, to a certain degree, yes. Not the computer itself.
No, it's silly. The reason that public schools, of course it is. Nobody would argue that public schools have been underperforming and wasting money because of the presence of computers. The reason that schools are underperforming is, well, a variety of reasons. But it's not a coincidence that this is arguably the most protected industry shy of, electric utilities. This is the most protected industry in America. There is almost no competition in most places. There is almost no competition to provide this service. There is not enough competition for the teachers, which is why they're underpaid and frustrated themselves, as I believe that they should be, as many public servants are. And you don't have a robust industry where people are, competing to provide great service.
That's pretty much the classic capitalist answer, but we know that that's not true. We've seen Finland. They don't have a robust industry. All their schools are state. They're public. They switched them all over to public about 40 years ago. They're number 3 in the world. France has a much better public school system, paying more into it. It's a protected system. It's the teaching techniques. I was going to be a professor before I got sidelined. Teaching techniques are ultra important, and we have allowed tech companies.
Yes, they are, and we would have better teaching techniques if we had people trying new techniques. I believe you're absolutely right about that. And the only way to get new techniques, to your point, different computer technologies, different teaching technologies, and different ways of doing business. I believe you're exactly correct. And the way to institute that is to create competition so that people are trying new things. And yes, occasionally that'll mean an organization fails, but that's okay. We tolerate failure in every other industry. We could tolerate an organization or two or a school or two going out of business once in a while. That I don't think Americans find that particularly scary.
Well, I think we should. I mean, what if it's the only school in your area? I mean,
that's what we want. We want competition in your area. We want 2 schools to go head to head trying to compete to provide good service to their families. Maybe one wins, one loses, but that's the best way to find out who's doing a good job, right?
Well, I mean, is that really how they won? I mean,
Yes.
I could undercut you, right? I could be, let's say your method is all going to be profit driven, right? So if I can manipulate the market for students, right?
This is just like any other industry,
Yeah, well, I mean,
yes, any industry, you've got price competition. That's not a bad thing. We don't want people to not be able to compete on price. If I can provide a better service or the same service and do it for less and let families keep a little, bit of money in their pocket, I would think that you would think that would be a good thing. I think that would be a good thing, wouldn't it?
I think in this case that we misplaced the profit motive in this specific example of education, because when we turn it into a for-profit education, we see what happens, right? I mean, DeVry, ITT Tech defrauded thousands of students in the goal of profits. I mean, I think that's one of our problems with the education.
There is fraud in certain institutions. There's no question about it. Fraud is illegal, by the way.
Well, sure, fraud is illegal
in public institutions.
Sure, fraud is always illegal.
Private institutions, we shouldn't tolerate fraud anywhere.
But I'm just saying that. I mean, don't you think that the impetus to defraud people increases with the rate at which you can make a profit margin? In this case?
It's actually data shows the opposite, where you have a lack of a bottom line incentive. Money wish-washes around. It's not typically illegal, but this is why public schools have so much funding and are so incapable of delivering a good service compared to what private schools do. There's just no incentive to do a good job with shepherding the money, with husbanding the money in an efficient way.
Now, I went to a private school. By the way,
I sent my kids to public schools and private schools. I know the difference. I also know the difference between good public schools and bad public schools.
Well, that's true.
Because I sent my kids to schools in the best district in the United States, in Arlington, Virginia, and a district in Broward, Florida, that wasn't anywhere near that good. You learn the difference.
I'm sure you do. But my point was that my Catholic school went out of business. Right? I mean, it was one of the ones that couldn't make it, and it left.
That happens.
That happens.
Catholic schools don't have access to public funding the way that public schools do. So sometimes you do have schools that go out of business. But it is also true that most of these archdioceses. I'm not Catholic, but
I know. I'm just saying.
The Archdiocese of Miami does a heck of a job competing on quite literally half the money that public schools have per pupil, and they do a nice job. They don't provide all the full range of services that the public schools do, for kids with special needs and things like that. But they do a heck of a job providing good service to the typical student.
True.
I was really impressed by the Catholic schools in Broward County.
I know. I have a friend who sends her son to a Catholic school, but you also have to remember that a lot of the other private schools, right, in Broward County, the charter schools, have been able to pick and choose which people with deficits they want to allow in and not. The public school had to take everybody off the spectrum.
That is very true in many cases. It's not true in every case, but it's very true in many cases. And the really private, I don't know if you would call charter schools completely private. They are obviously pursuant to a charter, which is why we call them charter schools. But the schools that are completely in the private sector don't provide the same range of services at all. That's absolutely true, which is part of the reason why they're able to provide service at such a cheap price. But we want them to be able to compete, and compete they do. I wish that everyone was competing for the same dollars instead of the public schools being the only ones that are able to have access to public funding.
Well,
it's not really really what you would call a competitive market.
Well, that's true. It's not a competitive market, but it's not really supposed to be a competitive market, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of the public school. It should be,
just like any other. There's nothing special about K through 12 education that says, market forces wouldn't work here. The thing that's special is that we've got political forces trying to keep competition out. eventually that will go by the wayside. I don't know if that'll be in 5 years or 55 years, but eventually this industry will be modernized and will be a hell of a lot better. And when we look back from that vantage point, we will see that the 20th century was just one giant educational dinosaur.
Really?
Yes. No, there's no question about it.
I'm a little skeptical of that, considering how I looked around all the other major nation states, right, with very vibrant popular public school education, and they're all doing much better. And it looks to me that maybe our problem isn't.
They are doing better. Our public schools are awful. Not in every place, but in many places, our public schools are just awful. If you look in Chicago and Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and all through Florida, you got to be frustrated by the performance of our public schools. True.
But here's another question I have, because I've been studying the public school issue for quite some time here, especially in my town. Now, you can't speak to this specifically, but you can speak to the overall need, right? And the curiosity I have, if you feel that private education won't also tend to create a top-heavy administrative policy in your model once you start to corporatize it. I mean, that's part of the other problem. I mean, we have one of the most expensive districts in the area, because we've got one school building for the district, 300 kids roughly, and a vice principal, a principal, a building superintendent, a district superintendent, and that's a lot of high-end power right there. Salary rise.
It's in the public school system, not the private school.
That's in the public school system, right? The charter schools are just the same. They have all the same thing, except they've got other costs, because most of them have to rent their land from another charter company that owns the property. Usually the guy that starts it creates a classic little grift for himself, is that he also becomes the real estate agent that buys the school property, and then he charters out the school and pays himself through those funds.
Okay, look, Connor, you've got an accounting problem. Yes, it is true that public schools typically own their school districts typically own the schools, and so as an accounting construct, they don't report the rent. But that doesn't mean that they're cheaper. It just means that on paper
they don't say they were cheaper. What I'm saying is that when you take away, right, all of the money for public schools and you redistribute it towards your you're not going to redistribute. It's just not going to be there anymore in your plan. It's just going to vanish, and the schools are going to have to generate all these funds themselves. Are we not going to see this top end heavy corporate model that everyone likes so much? With more and more.
Connor, I don't know if you're gaslighting me or what. The top heavy model that we have today is in public schools, not in private schools.
Well, it's not. But I'm saying this. Don't you think that that's going to transfer over? I mean, we see it in.
There's no reason to believe that private schools would be mismanaged. If they were, they would go out of business.
And they have, right? I mean,
some of them have, not most of them, but some of them do. Absolutely. Like I say. The Archdiocese of Miami really impressed me. I've looked at some of the other schools in Broward County before sending my kids to the Catholic schools. The Baptist school, runs a nice program. But, talk about lean. They're insanely lean, and the teachers don't make as much money. They're there because they believe in the cause. Mm-hmm. The schools don't have the money to compete for the same pool of people as the public schools do in terms of teachers. The private schools run incredibly lean. I don't think, whatever you may feel about private schools, you can't argue that there's a lot of fat in that system.
Well, some schools don't have a lot of fat. Others do. Other private schools, Andover, Exeter, Phillips Academy, all of those, they have a lot. They're not as lean. I mean, because they've.
Well, they may be. Maybe your kids are going to Exeter. No, mine aren't. So I haven't.
But I'm just saying.
Broken down their income statement, but people love to go to school there. People are, wanting their kids to go there. That's up to them. If Exeter is charging too much, then heck with them. But for the most part, what you and I are talking about are private schools.
This extra money that you're
competing on price because they have to. And by the way, the vast majority of private schools in the future don't even exist today because they can't get access to funding in poor neighborhoods. So in Broward County, for example, you've got whole cities with virtually no private school competition. It's just awful. Only the wealthy families can afford to go to the private schools. It's a terrible thing.
And you don't think that'll happen in a pure competition model either?
In a pure competition model, meaning competing for the same dollars, competing for the public financing. No, you trust me when I say the Archdiocese of Miami would open a school in, the west side of Broward County in a New York minute if they had access to public funding.
Okay, but for public funding, but now you've taken public funding away. Your model is that we've gone away with that, right? I mean, there's no more state funding. That's gone. Now it's
someday, 75 years from now, maybe. But
whoever has the endowment.
In reality, we have a great deal of money that is collected in the public sector to finance public schools. And this is why private schools can't compete, because families choose the free option, which makes sense. I mean, of course, a lot of smart families pick the free option. In many cases, the public schools are pretty good. Even if the public schools aren't very good, they pick the free option because it's all they can afford.
But it's really not free. We're all paying school taxes every year, so it's
that's
paid.
Exactly right. But families pick the option for which they don't have to pay tuition because it's all they can afford.
True. Okay, so here's what I was getting at is that your overall model, though, is a pure competition, right? I mean, that's your goal, right?
And the goal in the long run is complete competition for those public dollars, and then in the long run, will it be the case that eventually localities decide not to raise money for public finance? I can't predict that. I'm guessing that in the future, and I don't know whether that's, many decades or just a few decades, but someday in the future, maybe at the end of this century, will some localities decide not to raise money to publicly finance schools? Yeah, I suspect that there will be places where people experiment with that. I don't know how that will go. That's an ethical call. Some people like the idea.
All right. Yep. I mean, that's perfectly fair. I was just trying to find out how far you're willing to go down that deregulation portion of this.
I'd be willing to try it. I think localities have a right to experiment. I think that there will be localities that experiment with that. I don't think that I'll be around. I think that's far enough in the future. I won't be around to see it.
Okay. Those are all fair answers. I just wondered how far. Okay. I mean, because that was a big part of your deregulation. I mean, that seems to be one of the planks that every libertarian I talk to speaks about. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea for someone to experiment with it. I would be optimistic, but I'm not optimistic it'll happen anytime soon.
All right, that's fair. Let's move on to your next one. Department of Energy, stay or go?
Well, except for the piece of it that has to keep track of nuclear weapons. I don't want nuclear weapons to run around, deregulated.
That's better than some. That's better than some. I've heard some that are like nothing, zero, nada. And I have to ask the question.
Right. I don't think the Department of Energy has a logical role in a federal republic like ours. I think that individual states can make up their own minds what type of regulatory environment they want. Indeed, I think that we want competition among states to try to provide the best business, best economic environment possible that is consistent with the underlying ethics and values of their populations, of course. But I think that if we got the federal government out of it, you would see states providing this competition. There would be winners and there would be losers. And I think that it would be an experiment worth having.
All right. Okay. That's fair. How about this one? If we're the big one, OSHA.
OSHA?
OSHA, the Labor Department, all of those. on
I'm
the
a big
chopping block.
believer in the role of unions. Unions drive me crazy sometimes, just like corporations do, and just like governments do. Any big organization will drive you crazy from time to time. But it is true that the vast majority of advancements in occupational safety and improving the conditions of workers in the United States have come from a robust role played by unions, especially in the 20th century. Unions are waning in their role and in their effectiveness. And now, in many cases, unions are actually an inhibiting factor in advancing the careers of, for example, teachers and police officers. I was a member of a police union for a dozen years, and I can tell you that, that union missed lots of opportunities to make conditions better for police officers. But having said that, I think in a modern economy, a federal OSHA is really anachronistic. I think that states ought to be picking this up. I think that states, again, ought to be competing. And I think that most people would see that a relatively deregulated environment would be, in the long run, better for not only businesses, capitalists, as you would put it, but in the long run, workers as well.
I'm not sure I'm sold on that. I'm really surprised at your union answer, because I was a Teamster in college at UPS. So, but
people have a First Amendment right to get together, whether that's in the form of, protesting on the street or forming a corporation or forming a union. It's just different ways of doing different things. They'll drive you crazy. Like I say, the teachers unions and the police unions, do things that undermine competition, but that doesn't mean that they can't play a productive role in a modern economy.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just curious. But if we take your model, right, of every state competing against each other, the state that deregulates the most, right, is going to be the best state for pure profit generation. We can't deny that. The state that says, you know what, screw it, we're going to let you poison the water, cut down all the trees, and tough luck.
Well, those are not my words.
No, those are
look, I think that we ought to have I do believe that states will win when they have relatively deregulated environments. That does not mean that the court system won't work. I think that one of the things that's gone wrong in how we hold corporations and individuals accountable in this country is that we've undermined the way that the court system should be working, because we have given so much deference to regulatory agencies, and we've allowed regulatory agencies to undermine the way the courts work with imposing rules instead of letting people behave like adults and then punishing them when they misbehave. I think is a better model than setting up rules that have proven, notwithstanding best intent. I'm not suggesting that regulatory agencies are evil with evil intent that are unpatriotic. But as a practical matter, in many cases, it's just a model that hasn't worked very well.
I'm just trying to figure out how you go to court. So every case would have to set precedent then, right? I mean, in your model.
And we do have precedents.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, so then we are, in fact, generating laws. You just don't want it from a regulatory body. You want it from a judicial body.
That's right. I think that we need to do a better job of allowing citizens to, gain stature in court, to be recognized in court when damages have been done. I'm not a believer in not holding people accountable when they've done wrong, right? When you cause damage in the public, when you cause damage to others, you need to be held accountable. There's no question about that. But the regulatory model, like I say, as well intended as it may have been 100 years ago and 50 years ago, has proven relatively inefficient, not for a number of reasons, not the least of which is corporate capture and political capture of many of these agencies, captured by political ideas that haven't proven really effective either in allowing economic growth or holding corporations accountable, and capture by the corporations themselves, or at least industry representation.
Okay, all right, I understand that. So, but I'm just kind of curious though. How do you hold someone accountable, right, in this model? I mean, what is your ideal? Now, I'm not saying that it's going to happen tomorrow, so we don't have to worry about 75 years from now. But I mean, but your ideal representation of this model, because that's really what I like talking about, ideas, right? I mean, philosophers.
Sure.
Do.
Well, in a perfect world,
Perfect.
which to your point isn't going to be next week, but in a perfect world, you want people who are damaged, right? Mm-hmm. Even if that means in the public sector, a representative of a river, right? The classic example is a river that's been polluted. Mm-hmm. You want whoever owns the river, which is presumably in the public sector. Not always. It's not always in the public sector, but you want that river ownership to be represented, to be able to gain standing in court, to bring action against those who have polluted it. So you want people to be held accountable.
Okay. See, I didn't expect that. I expected the Milton Friedman, no. The river's actually owned by the corporation. And they're going to rent it out.
There are cases where it is, but I don't have a problem with the river being owned by a corporation.
But that limits our ability to do anything, right? Because once it becomes private property, well, I'm sorry, it leached into your field, right? I mean, what do I do then, right?
Well, true, but that brings up another. I don't have necessarily a problem with a corporation buying a river, but it does bring up the two issues. One is from whom, right? I mean, there has to be a fair price exchanged in the public sector. Eyes wide open, by the way. But the other thing is that a river is typically, a river is a tricky thing. A river flows, right? And so when you buy the water, you're buying everything that water does downstream.
Right.
And so you necessarily need to be able to hold accountable whoever is doing whatever they are doing to that water that has effects downstream. If someone wants to pollute their own river, you're right. There's not much you can do about it. But if they're the ones that own the river, then, to heck with them. But the problem is that affects people downstream, and you need to be able to hold people accountable for that.
You see, you're the only guy I've ever gotten to say that who's a libertarian. And I've tried it with a lot of people.
Well, it's the truth.
I'm happy, right? I mean, I'm happy because usually some people go totally anarcho-capitalist on me, right? And it's like, nope, no problem, right? It's buyer beware.
Well, and you could be an anarcho-capitalist. I mean, I don't mind corporations buying rivers, and I don't mind a lack of government, but that doesn't mean you get to, punch someone in the face with your river downstream. You got to be.
But the anarcho-capitalists would say that the guy who first, stuck his first stick in that river, right, and said it's mine, owns it, right? Zero cost. He discovered said river, so it's his, and or maybe if you're more like what's his name, Hobbes or Locke, you might decide that he might have had to put like a dock there first, right? And then he improved it. He did some labor.
Well, look, economists have learned over the last 100 years that there are more efficient ways of allocating resources than just allowing everyone to line up their Conestoga wagon at the starting line and setting off a rifle and having everyone run out there and put stakes in the ground. There are more efficient ways of handling this.
True. I mean, I agree with that. But I'm just happy because I've just never gotten a really good answer to you for the first one who's given me one. So thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, there's some hope, that not everyone is like, well, you're just out of luck. You just didn't get there first.
Well, look, it is a tricky, allocating resources is always a tricky thing, especially when, I'm not a fan of governments just claiming that not only that they own everything, but they ought to own everything. Just because a government has, a huge proportion of land, like in certain states out west, that doesn't make it a good idea just because that's the way it is today.
No, I mean, personally, I would like to put that back in the hands of the people as a collective, and then they get to decide. I mean, which in theory, right? I mean, we do live in a republic. In theory, that's what's supposed to happen. But as you've pointed out before, corporate capture and has nullified that. I mean, and then they've known that since the 1870s, right? I mean, they're like, oh yeah, sure, you create the commerce the commerce commissions. We'll just get our guys on the board, and we'll make sure that we can, tweak it so that it works for us.
Well, they're different words of saying the same thing. Governments and corporations and unions and cities and states, they're all just collections of humans.
Sure.
At the end of the day, they all have their interests, and they are selfish, and they are competitive. Mm-hmm. And everyone needs to be held accountable. Just because you're in a group doesn't mean that we shouldn't hold your group accountable. I don't see that much distinction among these organizations, except for the fact that I resent it when some of these organizations think that they can use force against others. And that's, as a libertarian, that's my big problem with government, right? Because governments claim to themselves monopolies over the use of force. And so you have all these weird situations where they make rules that benefit themselves. And for the rest of us, it's love it or shove it.
True. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, you don't seem to be one of those libertarians that I usually get that says, well, no, it's 51, I don't want the tyranny of the 51%, right? I mean, you seem to be, you're on the right, but you seem to still want to have, certain powers of collective powers still, right? Like everyone would vote in the state for
people have a right to get together and make decisions. That's where unions come from and corporations. Mm-hmm. No one could argue that unions and corporations don't have a right to exist. There are other things that people have a legitimate interest in doing collectively. I think that humans have a right to get together and decide that they want a criminal code.
Sure.
And and have a right to decide in a court system, have a right to decide how they want that criminal code enforced, what kind of police force they want, if any. And they have a right to hold that police force accountable and to force it to behave in a way that aligns with their values and, with their ethics. Mm-hmm. You could call those collectivist things. But people have a right to do things together where it's most efficient to do so. That doesn't mean, we should get together, take a vote, and decide that because you live in certain geographic area, we now have a right to impose on you decisions that we made on your behalf. That's something I don't like.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, that is the big problem with any type of representative democracy, right? You always have that issue of someone being far away from the issues, who's only tangentially related to it, voting on them.
Right.
And I agree with that.
Or right? Even people in the middle that don't agree.
That's true. I'm surprised at how much we actually agree on. I wasn't sure when I.
Well, keep going. We'll find something to fight about.
A good argument's good, always. We'll save that to the end. Okay, I'm really puzzled, though, by privatizing the risk in police officers. I mean, as a police officer, could you explain that to me? I don't think anyone really has asked you that clearly.
Sure. There's a couple of different pieces. And let me say at the outset, the object of the game, right, mm-hmm. is to make it look more like other businesses that work better. Most businesses, most industries in the United States work better than policing and teaching. That's just the truth of the matter. We want greater competition, and we want people held accountable and compensated in accordance with their performance. So, for example, that means that if you're a community, if you're a town or a county, right, mm-hmm. you should have the right to hire either, your own police department, public sector employees. I worked for a town in Broward County, and they had their own police department. Mm-hmm. And it's not a bad model because the local politicians have a lot of control over the police department. And the good thing about that model is when it works well, it doesn't usually work very well. But when it works well, the politicians can force the police department to behave in a way that reflects what the constituents want in a police department, right? That's in a perfect world, that's what you want. Alternatively, as the town commissioners reminded us from time to time, they could fire us all and hire the sheriff's office.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a little bit of competition, not much competition. They had two choices. A lot of communities in the United States don't even have two choices, right? They're too small to have their own police department, and they got a sheriff's office, and that's it. And if you hate your sheriff's office, you're screwed. So part of what we want in the way of reform is a change in state law to facilitate the ability of communities to hire a private sector organization or another public sector organization to offer policing service. So as an example, if you had a rule in your town that said you can't contract out garbage pickup,
Sure,
you would say that's weird, right? Why can't our town hire Bob's garbage pickup service to handle our community? Mm-hmm. That would be weird. If the rule was you could only do this with public sector employees, you would find that a little bit strange. The same thing in police work. You need a lot of control over police officers. There's no question about that. But, don't be hiring a private sector organization that doesn't have good control over their employees. And
I think that's going to be the big problem for your idea right there, right? I mean, having that control, because it is a private corporation, right? I mean, you do how do we balance that balance of having the right amount? I mean, because then we start getting to regulations. We don't want too many of those. Gotta get those, and then having the right amount of power that in each group to offset each other. I mean, it is
tricky, but it's tricky now.
It's tricky, but
I think people don't realize now how hard it is for a mayor to control a police department. It's largely governed by law, as it should be, and as it still would be. Even if the police officers were in the private sector, they would still be governed by all the same rules and laws. It is a tricky thing to control, but the point is that it's tricky now, and you don't have a death penalty for the organization as you should. You need an ability to replace. Now, in a big city, you wouldn't want to. If you were mad at your police department in New York, you wouldn't want to replace the entire 45,000 officer force at one fell swoop. But you want the right to say, right, in this particular district, we want to be able to replace it with someone else, whether that's the sheriff's office, the state police, a private sector organization, or something completely different. There's no economic reason. There's no real control reason why it should be illegal, right, to have competition for who provides those services.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but don't we have kind of that competition presently? I mean, yes, they're all basically, we have the state, you have the Florida State Troopers, you got the sheriffs, and then you got the local. So if the local does disappear, they can be taken over by those two other groups and covered, maybe. Right. I mean, if you're not too big of a state of a town, right? Like my town only has 1,600 people, so instead of having two troopers, they'd have three troopers, right? And that would be. You
don't have your own police department, I'm guessing, right?
We do. Oh. It's all, but it's part time. That's the funny thing. It's all part time.
Right.
Except for the one guy.
Sheriff's office handle it, or
no? They use the sheriff's office as the dispatch.
Sure, we did too. In Broward, for the city I worked for, we hired the sheriff's office for dispatch, and then the police work was actually public sector employees employed by the city, and then contracted out certain functions. Like we hired the sheriff's office for certain laboratory work, right? It doesn't make sense for every little police department to have its own laboratory.
No, it doesn't, but we're getting a prison. Not a prison. We're getting they took away the senior center, right? And they moved that to somewhere else, and they put in a new holding facility. We have like 4 crimes a year. I don't know who they're going to hold.
Yeah, that doesn't seem very efficient to me.
It doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, you could literally just put the guy in a handcuff on a chair for like 2 hours and wait for the sheriff to show up.
Well, there are cases where, sometimes detainees have to sit in a car for a couple of hours, or, you spend 45 minutes to bring them to the county seat. Sometimes that's the most efficient way to handle it.
Yeah, that's it is. But I mean, we don't have that problem because, like I said, we do not have a crime problem here. I do
Right.
not.
Well, good for you.
I do not understand why we're spending all this money on this thing. Right? We got a new part-time. I make that very strongly here. We have a part-time police chief. We have one full-time officer. That's it, and he's like the lowest guy in the totem pole.
That's really interesting. So anyway, to finish up on your important question, the other piece of improving competition and accountability is for there to be more detailed accountability at the officer level, not just at the agency level. And you start in this regard, you replace qualified immunity, which is not as important as most people make it out to be. It doesn't affect that many cases, but psychologically, it's extremely important to citizens and to officers, to agencies. Anyway, replace qualified immunity with a requirement for officers to carry their own liability insurance. So it's more like surgeons, for example, carry their own liability insurance, right? We're not advocating a model where if someone makes a good faith mistake on some random Wednesday, they lose their house. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is require them to be responsible for their own premiums, so that if you're a serial mistake maker, you'll get priced out of the market, hopefully, because your insurance premiums will go up. And the other thing that's really useful about the model is that the insurance company acts as a check on the system from the outside, that third-party check on the system, because as you know, or I'm sure you can imagine, it's very hard. Police unions do a good job of preventing too much transparency, right? They protect the privacy of officers and the exposure of officers to too much scrutiny from the outside. And it makes it difficult to hold officers accountable sometimes. And an insurance company would not put up with that crap, right? An insurance company is going to need all the information that's available so that they can do a good job of pricing. Well, it provides a check.
Okay, but I mean, isn't that the same thing that happens if I work for a company and I'm a bad driver and I'm on their driver policy and I hit too many times, and then they go back to UPS and say, hey, you got to get this guy off of here because he's hit 4 cars in 3 days.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't even know if we need to make the officer have to cover his own premium. Just change some of the regulations between the agencies and their insurance company.
That's true. I agree with you. That's the way it should work. As a practical matter, my own observation is that system doesn't work very well because the unions make it very difficult to get rid of an officer.
Right, but I mean, if you made the regulations are that, look, he's an insurance. I mean, because I was a...
Oh, yeah, but what you're advocating for is politicians doing a better job.
I'm advocating for just a better job. I was just saying that it seems to me that we don't, because I know how poorly paid some police departments are. It seems that it might be pretty unfair. I mean, because the insurance companies always have.
Yeah, market forces would increase the amount of money that they're paid. Otherwise, people wouldn't take the job. But the alternative is the system we have now.
Oh, I agree.
I always wish that politicians did a better job negotiating with unions. But as a practical observation, it's my own personal experience that politicians just don't do a very good job of this. And sometimes that's because the unions have politically captured the politicians. And sometimes it's just unfamiliarity and incompetence on the part of the politicians, the local politicians.
Well, that's true. That's true. So I want to get to my last question is about your vote. I think the one thing I noticed that I really liked was that you wanted term limits, and you had a whole bunch of. Let's see. Does this? Oh, geez, why did it?
Term limits are one of those things that has been contentious a little bit inside of libertarianism, because the most libertarian answer is you should have the right to vote for whatever fool you want, right? If you want to vote for the same idiot 30 times in a row, then it's your right to do so. The problem is, of course, that incumbency is something that undermines democracy. It's an unfair advantage. It's a corrupting force. It gives these politicians a way to manipulate the system that allows them influence.
It's like any monopoly.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And so while it may be true that, term limits from a strictly libertarian point of view are a bad idea, it is unfortunately also true that it's a bad idea whose time has come, right?
I don't know if it's a bad idea. I think on the other hand, right, I mean, it increases overall, democracy that if you're really looking for freedom and democracy, right, the ability to get more people into office increases that. So that's what you're doing. Yeah.
I agree.
And there's
competition. I'm just pointing out that in a perfect world, you would view it as a bad idea. It's just not a perfect world.
Sure. Well, the other one I had a question about is you say you want to put a 1% charge on getting or 1,000 signatures. And now so if I'm running for like state governor, right, instead of having to jump through all these hoops, I could just go down to the Board of Elections and, the governor makes like $100,000, so I give him a $10,000 check, a $1,000 check, and then I'm on the ballot.
Well, look, the specifics. I'm not the right guy to get into the weeds with you on what ballot access in a perfect world would look like, but I can tell you this: the bar is set weirdly high today for people to get on the ballot. So, for example,
I know. Even in a small town,
you do.
Even in a small town, it's hard to get on a ballot.
It is. We're going to be on the state. Chase Oliver is my running mate. He is our presidential nominee. A great guy, by the way, great young man. He is. He and I are on the ballot. Are going to be on the ballot November 5. In what I believe will be 48 states.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's really impressive.
Well, we were on the ballot in 50 states last time, but the Republicans and Democrats got together.
Well, and that's what I'm saying is that it's been the third parties have been taking a shellacking in courts about ballot access.
And in no small part, it's because we did very well. Larry Sharp is a well-known libertarian podcaster, gubernatorial candidate with great success in New York in 2 cycles ago, but he did such a good job, and I love Larry. I'm so grateful he did a great job, but he did such a good job that the backlash was Republicans and Democrats setting the bar insanely high, requiring 45,000 certified signatures in 6 weeks. We missed the mark, and we're going to be off the ballot. If the Libertarian Party can't clear that threshold, nobody can, right?
That's a huge threshold, and the time limit's way too small.
RFK missed it too. I think that the fact that he missed New York was the nail in that coffin on his campaign.
Probably was part of it, but what I was getting at is though the only problem I have with you setting the bar so low is that maybe somebody with a lot of money would sit down and say, wait a minute, I could get $200,000. I can go get 200 weird guys that'll take out this, and this group. And I'll just pay them to run for a couple of months before. No,
I hear you. There is something to be said about not setting it too low until no argument there. I agree. There's got to be a happy medium, but it can't be so high that you've only got one Republican, one Democrat, and everybody else can go pound sand.
Yeah, I agree with that too. But before we wrap up in the next 6 minutes, I'd like to just ask this one final question. What about real ranked choice ballot by proportion? Not that phony ranked choice where, I pick my ranks, but, magically because the guy I really liked only got 20%, all my other votes went to the top guy. I mean, do you support proportionality like that, where, if Libertarian gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats?
Yeah, I think it would be great. Clearly, we need a different system than we have today. I would argue that the two-party system, not just because it's only two parties, but because it's two parties that don't allow anyone else in, the point of our previous discussion.
That's the kind of point of having, that's the ultimate monopoly. And, well, we should say.
It is. Well, and because they have so much in common, it is in many cases like a monopoly. In some cases, like a duopoly. They do compete in some ways, but in many ways, they don't compete. They both believe in spending a lot of money. They both believe in spending a lot of money specifically in the projection of military hegemony around the world. They're both on board with borrowing money like crazy. Neither one seems terribly upset that the Fed prints money like water. They have more in common in many cases than they do differences. And so they do behave like a monopoly. And that is a real problem. It's naturally corrupting. And in a case like we have in the United States, the past 20, I'm getting older, the past 40 years, really, where, you have a bifurcation of news sources in America. You don't have any incentive for parties to find overlapping interests. You have a natural tendency toward antagonism and therefore authoritarianism. You have to admit, no matter how you feel about the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they have given up on what used to be their political agenda. Their if you're a Republican, your number one objective is to keep Democrats out of power. Full stop. And the same thing for Democrats. They've given up on what used to be their agenda.
It's all campaigning, no actual governing at this point.
That's right. No actual service, no real competition for ideas. It's just a matter of competition and preening for media attention to keep everyone else out of power. And of course, that's where authoritarianism comes from. It comes from this idea that a politician would leverage fear, right?
Yeah.
What you really have to fear, they're going to tell you, is not the loss of your civil liberties. What you should fear is that other idiot coming to power. I'm the one you can trust, right? I need more power. Trust me. Elect me. I'll keep that other idiot from coming to power. Definitionally authoritarian.
No, I agree with that. That the idea of the two parties playing against fear of each other is what leads to an authoritarian type government. There's no doubt about that. And before we leave, just got to ask you this: have to get in my aviation question because I need that. Fan of the F-105 Thunder Chief or not? Come on, everyone loves the Thud.
Rephrase that. Give me an opportunity to split the hair.
Split the hair.
Rephrase that for the benefit of your audience.
Is the Republic F-105 a proud New York-based product of the Vietnam era and Cold War? Not one of the greatest planes ever made, and should be displayed in any town in New York that possible.
Well, all of that is true. There's no question about it. But as a libertarian, you're not going to get me to say that the government or anyone else should be picking winners and losers. Let me go you one further.
Sure.
Yes, it is true that I studied aeronautical engineering in upstate New York. It is also true, and look, I was at RPI during the George Low years, who used to be the chief engineer at Apollo and head of NASA. We worshiped the guy. He was fantastic in every way a human being could be fantastic. I don't like the idea of NASA, full stop. I don't like the idea that we are putting public sector resources into things like going to the moon and going to Mars.
Okay.
I think it's premature. I think that we are 50 years ahead of our time. I think that the sweet spot for this sort of silliness is no sooner than 50 years from now, and possibly as far in the distance as 150 years.
So you
I
think
we're
that?
wasting a lot of money.
Okay, I kind of agree with that. I mean, as an aviation buff, and I understand what you're saying is that, solve the things on Earth first before you try and go to Mars.
I think we got 2 astronauts up there right now who might agree with us that we've been trying to pull some stuff off technologically that we're not quite ready for.
Well, I agree. I hope they see this podcast and don't get angry about it. Like, no, damn you. We need to get down. Don't leave us up here.
We love them and we want to bring them home.
I know you do, but I'm just saying that.
I wish that we didn't have a government coercing people to go up there prematurely in the first place.
Okay. I never thought of it as coercing going up there. I don't know. But it was great to talk to you, Mike. I mean, I hope to have you on again sometime to talk about how maybe how it all turned out. You can give me some pointers on my campaign because I'm a long shot in a GOP, totally controlled town.
Well, good luck with that. I'm a fan of anyone trying to disrupt the status quo in American politics and undermine the duopoly. So I wish you every luck.
It's a monopoly here.
Wants to check out our campaign, they can go to votechaseoliver.com. They can go to MikeTermaat.com. MikeTermaat.com is a little bit trickier to spell because there's 2 A's in Ter Maat. But check us out and reach out and get involved.
All right. Well, thank you. And that'll be the end of our show. It was a great stream.